Our next speaker joins us to discuss being at the cusp of global transformation and how organizations can harness the power of AI and ChatGPT to drive digital transformation for your organization. We're hoping you might learn more about Hot Wheels and Barbie from our next speaker. Round of applause for Ramy Nassar.
So I've actually got to tell you something I wasn't going to tell you. About 20 months ago, I was kind of in a car accident that looked a little like Mary's picture, but I was on a bike. The car looked kind of like that. Not 14 bones broken, but I think 6 metal plates, and I literally can't count the screws. At least 30 screws holding this arm together. And I actually remember my surgeon telling me to start lifting weights, and I was very excited. And he literally told me to go and buy 1-pound weights. The extra fun twist was I had a roughly 1-month-old baby at the time. So it sucked. Couldn't lift him, couldn't carry him. Didn't change a diaper for the subsequent 3 months. So I've been on diaper duty ever since then. Unless I'm traveling, of course. So I'm Ramy. It's nice to meet you all. And I have to tell you, on the note of young one, ever since the youngest age, I've just been fascinated with time and time travel. How unfair it is that time seems to just go in one direction for us. In fact, just last weekend, my now roughly 21, 22-year-old boy watched Back to the Future with me. First movie he's seen in his whole life, Back to the Future. And so something that struck me about 2 years ago, I read a book by Neil deGrasse Tyson. I don't know if you know him. He's an astrophysicist and an educator, and someone who inspires me personally. And this book had one idea that really resounded with me, and it came down to, in my head, I framed it in the idea of time travel. He proposed that the world is unrecognizable every 30 years, roughly every generation. And the more I reflect on it, and the more times I read a Back to the Future storybook with my little guy, which is at least 3 times a day, the more I realize he is absolutely right. And let's think about that for a second. It's 2024. If we could go in a time machine, grab someone from 1994 and pull them into this room right here, right now, they'd be clueless on what we are doing. They'd be wondering why you are all staring at little 4-inch rectangles every 3 to 5 minutes and reaching for them. They wouldn't understand what was on our screen. Words like Google, and TikTok, and Snapchat, and Instagram would be just nonsense sounds to them. And yet you can do that same exact experiment from 1964 to 1994, or really any kind of generational period. And so what I want to do today, actually, explore with you a little bit about how I think we are actually starting to accelerate, and technology is the driver of that acceleration, and that it might not actually take 30 years for the world to be unrecognizable again. It might be 10, it might be 15, it might be just 5. It's happening so fast. So why don't I tell you a little bit about myself? I run a company called 1000 Days Out. We do consulting-y stuff. I really love what I do. I work in clinical drug trials, financial services, healthcare, agriculture, right across the board. I've got, as I mentioned, a very little one, and I've also got a 12-year-old boy, so I've got basically a teenager and basically a baby. Great combination. Don't spread your kids out by 10 years. It was a terrible idea. The last time I had a real job, I actually worked for Mattel. I had the unique privilege, the opportunity to build Mattel's innovation program from the ground up. Mattel did not have a formal innovation program. I was hired to build that practice, build a retail innovation lab, and experiment with technology. My older boy was about 7, 8 years old. He had years old at the time. He had a free supply of Hot Wheels for several years. He didn't take me up on the Barbies as much as I tried to do some gender balancing roles there, but we had lots of Hot Wheels and Barbies in our house for many years. But I got to see firsthand what works and what doesn't in the world of innovation. Nowadays, I teach at a number of universities. Actually, I'm Canadian. I came here from, I live just outside of Toronto. I teach at a number of universities in Canada, the US, and oddly enough, a university in Norway, where I teach an AI course, and I wrote a book on AI product design. So that's a little bit about me, which is the most boring part of all of this. The fun part, actually, if you have your rectangle, which is what I call smartphones, because I hate the term smartphone because they're not that smart, but if you have your rectangle/smartphone, you can scan this and you can play along. I have 2 skill testing questions and 0 prizes to give you for getting them right as we go. I went carry-on only, so I didn't bring any goodies along. When we get to that point, if you didn't scan this in time, it's absolutely fine. There'll be a URL you can use as well. But maybe to begin, why don't I tell you what I'm excited about, because I'm a fairly excited person. There are really 3 things. The first is the role of something I call strategic, I shouldn't say I didn't invent it. The role of strategic foresight. Strategic foresight is our ability to understand what might happen next, not what will happen next. None of us have that ability. We can't predict the future, but we can see signs and we can use forces, changes in behaviors, changes in technologies, trends to better understand where we are going. So that's the first thing. The second is technology. Right now, it's AI, it's the buzzword, it's really exciting. I've been talking about AI since way before it was cool. Now it's really cool, now it's really popular. But I find it fascinating for the most boring of reasons. I like the math. AI is actually just math, and I actually like doing the math, and I really like the math of it, and that's what kind of got me into it about a decade ago. But there are other aspects to our emerging technology landscape or ecosystem that leaders have to think about. Quantum computing, blockchain and cryptocurrencies, artificial intelligence, and believe it or not, synthetic biology. There are those who would say those forces are going to come together over the decade and change everything about the way we live, work, and play. And then the third one, which might initially seem like the odd duck here, is innovation management, innovation leadership. Innovation leadership is how we take technology and make it real within organizations, whether that's government, education, nonprofit, or enterprise. And that's where the work from Mattel kind of comes in. So I would like to know, when I say the word either futurism or strategic foresight, you can pull out your rectangle now, what words come to mind? And I'll give you my rough working definition of it as I do that. And for me, strategic foresight is not about what are the trends. It's not about what are the top 10 things that are going to shape something next year. It's actually about resilience. It's about understanding that the world we will run our businesses, the world we will run our organizations in a year, 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now, will look different than it does today. And if we are thoughtful about that and we look back, we can actually see forward. And that's where this idea, it's why I love time travel. Actually looking back, and I'm not a historian by any means, but looking back gives us the ability to see what is coming in the future and to look ahead. And it almost feels like a magical superpower to me. And so I'm not going to read this all to you, but it is always fascinating to sort of see what words come up, this idea of planning, technology, looking ahead, thoughtful, contemplating, anticipating. I really like the word anticipating. There are tools within the strategic foresight landscape that let us do this at a systematic level. And that's what I get excited about. I am not a person who comes up and said, here are the 10 things that are going to change your business or your industry over the next 5 years. I'm the person who comes up and says, here's how you can uncover those 10 things and figure that out and figure what it means to you. So my working definition of strategic foresight of futurism is the art and science of resilience to change. So let's talk, and I mentioned these already. Let's talk a little bit about the science side of it. I love asking people who this is. I have heard the wildest of guesses. Every once in a while, someone guesses right. I've heard everything from Plato or Socrates to someone who was convinced this was a depiction of Al Gore. I've looked it up. I don't see the resemblance. This is the Roman god Janus. In Roman mythology, there was a god of war, god of thunder. Janus drew the short straw when they were handing out god powers. Janus was the god of doors and gates. Why would the Romans believe that there was a god of doors and gates? Well, doors actually represented, and this is big, the duality of man. Janus represented the battle between good and evil, past and future, forward and backward. And your fun cocktail party fact of the day, the month of January comes from Janus. January is the month where you can look back at the year that just finished or look ahead to the year that has just begun. I know, right? You'll sound really smart. People will want to come talk to you when you tell them about Roman gods at a cocktail party. So the reason I'm showing you this is someone much smarter than me came up with a tool. It's called a Janus cone. And we're not going to read any of this on here, but this is a tool and a practical approach of looking backward to identify disruptions, milestones, economic events, social, political, health, technologies, and then not quite forecast, but extrapolate. Where do these trends, where do these forces, where do these changes in behaviors or expectations lead? And the idea of understanding future expectations is a wildly important thing. And I'll share with you very briefly. I still bike, even after my accident. I actually bought 2 bikes since the accident, 2 new ones. And I remember buying a bike from a company in Germany. This was a custom-built mountain bike to my specifications. And I had the final checkout online. It charged me $99 to ship it to Canada in 5 to 7 days. My gut reaction, I was like, what? I have to pay for shipping and it's going to take a week? Amazon broke my brain. Shipping is free. Shipping is same or next day. I truly blame them for changing my expectations, but that notion of changing consumer expectations, understanding where those goes, is a really important thing, and that is a singular point on that. But I'm sure everyone can think about how your expectations, whether as a consumer, as a parent, as a family member, as just a member of society, have changed over time. And that's a big part of foresight. So the Janus cone is a tool, it's an approach, it's a workshop-y kind of thing that you can do with teams to do this systematically and look to the future, even if you don't have a crystal ball. So I promised you something on time travel. I'm semi-obsessed with Back to the Future. So what I want to do is very quickly think about AI through 3 lenses. And those lenses are now, next, and never. So let's go back roughly 1 generation from where we are today. What happened in 1997? You can shout it out. Something very important. Several important things happened. I'll give you a hint. The first one, George Clooney, Time Magazine Person of the Year, though back then they actually called it Man of the Year. First Harry Potter book was published. Little Wizard Boy, first book, not even movie. Titanic sailed into theaters and into our hearts. But I would say the single most interesting thing that happened in my nerdy worldview was a game of chess. This is Garry Kasparov, the at the time world's best, highest rated chess player, playing against what looks like a lovely, fine looking gentleman on the right, but he's actually not playing against him. He's playing against a computer called Deep Blue. The person on the right of the image, his entire job is to look at what the screen says and move the piece in that space. Garry lost. It was the first time the world's best chess player had lost to a computer. We didn't really call it AI at the time, but there were whiffs of that notion. I'm going to try to convince you it wasn't a big deal. Do you play chess? Okay, neither do I, but I still play with my son. And when I play with my son, it goes a little something like this in my head. If I do this, he'll do this, I'll do this, he might do this. I kind of lose track after about 2 or 3 moves back and forth. Deep Blue was a supercomputer. It could just do a lot of calculations. In fact, 20 billion calculations, the amount of time allowed for 1 move. That equated to seeing 24 moves and counter moves into the future. But not one combination of those moves, all of them. And so while we don't really think of it that way, but it was actually a time machine. It could see into the future. It could see millions of possible states that board could be in at the end, choose the best positional advantage, and just do the single move working towards that. So It's the exact same effect as if you wanted to break into my iPhone, you would try the code 0000, then 0001 and 2, and on average, after 5,000 attempts, you would have gotten it. We call it brute force. And that's all this was. It wasn't really AI. Now, if we jump back in our time machine for a moment here, we get this really cool, literal mirror image. This is Lee Sedol. Lee Sedol, in 2018, so 20 years later, was the world's highest ranked Go player. Go is a very, very simple game. The main difference between it and chess is that the board is bigger. It is so much bigger that the number of possible states the board can be in is estimated to be 10 to the 170. Now, if you've forgotten your scientific notation since high school, that is a 1 with 170 zeros behind it, roughly the equivalent of what your kid's national share of the debt's going to be in 10 years, from what I understood earlier. For contrast, the entire known universe is made up of about 10 to the 80 atoms. So we cannot use the technologies of yesterday to solve the problems of today. That's why it took 20 years to go from beating the world's best chess player to beating the world's best player of the game called Go. 20 years. That's where AI came in. Neural networks based very loosely on our human biology and how our brains work are what have unlocked this next generation of capabilities. Now that took 20 years. We only have to go 5 more years into the future, where last year, just out of curiosity, I typed into a generative AI tool, make me an image of Garry Kasparov playing chess against a robot. And it created this. Now, aside from the fact that you could trust me or you can Google it yourself, Garry Kasparov does not have 6 fingers on his right hand. I've triple checked that. This is a pretty good image. And if you break down just how much the algorithm understood about what I was asking for, this is remarkable. But this is what we can do today. And we need a great deal of imagination to think about what we can do tomorrow, that idea of AI next. Where is this all headed? So now, I want to ask you a skill testing question. I always come to this idea that a biologist named Edward O. Wilson put forward. In 2009, by the way, he said this: we have Paleolithic brains, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies. And when we combine those things, there's a ton of opportunity, but there's a ton of risk we want to think about. So let's start with the opportunity. I'm just curious on this room where you think the opportunities are, because I think it's remarkably interesting just not to see your own, but your peers' perspectives on a topic. So I'll give you a moment here I think you can vote for up to 3, I think I said it. And let me be clear, AI is going to disrupt a whole more than these 6 topics, but I wanted to pick a bit of a breadth of different areas of our shared world economy. So not surprising, labor and the future work is the biggest one here. It's one that I find fascinating because you will find many AI thought leaders and professionals who will say, AI will not displace work, it'll change the nature of work is. I don't think that's true. Because I don't think we were going to pour trillions of dollars into technology over the decade if we're not going to fundamentally change what labor even is. All different types of jobs. And we've seen, if we look back, we've seen this story before, we've seen the movie before. Look at what's happening in manufacturing, how much robotics is changing the nature of manufacturing. So leaders really have to think and use that foresight approach to think about what does this mean to our organization from a workforce and a future of work perspective. There's so many implications. So I would say that looks like the runaway winner here. I certainly hope healthcare improves. I have my skepticism that it might not, that it might actually have a harmful effect. But regardless, with teams, what we have to do is have these conversations. So thank you for participating in the skill testing question. So how do we think about what happens next, AI next? Well, that comes in the form of innovation. And innovation is the practical side of R&D. R&D is what happens in universities and research. Well, innovation is the complement. It's the commercialization of technology. And so, as was mentioned, I spent some time with Mattel. It was super interesting, especially in the past year or two with the reimagination, reinvigoration of Barbie. But in that innovation lab, while we worked with technology day in and day out, what we spent most of our time doing was talking to customers. Myself and my team, we went to Walmart's, Target's, Toys R Us stores all over North America and talked to staff. We talked to parents. We talked to kids to understand where they were going, what their expectations were. And that sort of back to basics human side of it is what fed into our technology strategy. The second thing we did was, I know it's easier said than done, we failed a ton. Out of the first 10 projects we took on, many of them AI and digital in focus, I wish I could say 9 of them failed. All 10 failed. Not a single one of them was commercialized. We did later on commercialize something. But we systematically de-risked things. These were tiny little initiatives. They were experiments. And leaders in the innovation space need to learn how to fail quickly, how to fail cheaply, to then get to the things that will succeed. And then the third thing we did, and we actually had a big mural on our wall in our lab, was this idea of being tech first, but not tech driven. It wasn't about the technology, ultimately it was about an experience a kid has with a product. And that's what drove us. And technology was going to play a big part in that, in the experience of buying it, in the experience of discovering it, maybe in the toy itself, but it wasn't about the technology. And these 3 driving principles is sort of what led to the ultimate success of the lab and a number of products and internal initiatives that have been commercialized since then. So I like to end on a very low note. Not to be a downer, but AI poses risk. I won't be the person who says it's an existential risk to humanity. There's lots of people who think that. But I certainly don't think it's a non-risk. I could spend a whole hour talking to you about the risk of bias in our data alone. The biggest risk is that bias in our data can be reflected back or amplified by an algorithm. And I have some terrifying examples that will make you cringe, even more so than pictures of my arm when it was all mangled up. I actually saved the X-ray pictures of my own arm as well. Thinking about fairness and equity in how we use technology, the time for that is now. Because AI never is about figuring out what do we want to make sure never happens in our shared future. The second dimension is privacy and security. I was very saddened to hear, actually driving in last night from O'Hare about the Children's Hospital in Chicago being taken offline. A sick kids hospital in Toronto, where I live, had a similar cyber attack a couple of months ago. The time is now to think about privacy and security and data and all of that through the lens of AI, because this problem will only get worse in the coming years. And then the third one, which we hinted at before, was workforce impacts. This will change the nature of what people do in their work. It may displace certain jobs. And that's just the reality of it. That's a story we've seen before. It's happened many, many times since the Industrial Revolution. Farming equipment changed what farmers do, and many, many times over. But we need to think about it now and think about how we communicate to employees. And there are systematic and proven approaches to doing that. I said I want to end on a low note. I don't actually, so I'll end with the words of the person who inspires me most in the world of AI. It's someone named Fei-Fei Li. And she said, flat out, AI doesn't have a conscience, but luckily we do. And it's our job to ensure that it's deployed effectively, safely, and responsibly. I've paraphrased a little bit, but mostly to avoid reinforcing harmful biases. So that's it for me. Thank you all so much. So nice to meet you.
Ramy, fantastic. Ramy Nassar.